So apparently, Nebraska is the center of the
America.
of America, except for I live in New York City, have a house like on Dallas, and I get mugged daily. Because everybody in New York gets mugged on a daily basis, but we
Right.
have houses like on Dallas, and I always had to say, "Have a nice day."
It's funny, my brother lived in Chicago for a while, and I was going to go visit him, and I got all nervous about Chicago because it's this dangerous city. And then I realized, wait a minute, I grew up in LA, and people think that's a dangerous city.
Hi, and welcome to Something to Talk About. I'm Linda McNamee, and for the next hour, we are going to be talking about ending domestic violence. But before I begin, I would like to thank you for joining us. If you do have any questions tonight throughout our conversation, please feel free to call in at 781-270-9199. I never call because I'm here, so I always forget the phone number. So it's 781-270-9199. If you have any questions for us, feel free to call. If you prefer not to call, you can always email me if you have questions, comments, ideas for our upcoming shows, and you can email me at talk@bcattv.org. I would like to thank my staff here not my staff, the staff here, sorry, they're not mine. We have Corey McNeil and Mike Duvall, who are staff members here at BCAT, and JT Marchant, who's a volunteer. And without them, this show would not be possible, and in fact, the station probably wouldn't be possible either. So thank you guys for everything that you do. And I would also like to thank my husband, Paul, for staying home for daddy date night with 2 cranky kids tonight. So sorry, Paul. But thank you, and hope you're having a good evening, and I will see you soon. So now I would like to introduce my wonderful guests, who are fountains of knowledge. We have Detective Anne-Marie Brown from the Burlington Police Department.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Okay. And we have Margaret, who works with Anne-Marie for REACH. Now, what's REACH's correct name?
It's Reach Beyond Domestic Violence.
Okay.
And the REACH, R stands for Refuge.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Sorry.
Refuge, Education, Advocacy, and Change.
Excellent. Well, thank you, ladies, for joining me.
Thank you for having
And
us.
we have, it's not the cheeriest subject, but I think there's a lot of information out there that you can help focus in my brain. So thank you.
Very welcome.
So first of all, I'd like to begin with little bit of background. Again, if you don't want to answer any questions, if you don't feel comfortable, definitely just say, nope, pleading the fifth. But Anne-Marie, how long have you been with Burlington Police Department, and how did you get involved in the domestic violence aspect of law enforcement?
I've been on the job for just over 23 years here in Burlington. And early on in my career, one of the captains, Captain George Devlin, who's retired now, asked me to help out with some domestic violence cases that were coming into the department. And eventually we applied for a grant, a federal grant,
Okay.
and we received that in 2004, which we had a collaboration with REACH, Sahelli, and a few other community partners.
Okay, now were those partners conditions of the grant?
Yes, we had to
Okay.
partner with a nonprofit.
Okay, and you chose 4.
We did.
Great. And now that you had mentioned before the show that the grant is over, but you are still continuing the program?
Collaboration, yes. Yes, REACH is a nonprofit, and they still fund Margaret to be with us
Okay,
for a certain amount of time each week.
okay. And Margaret, how did you become involved in REACH and domestic violence itself?
So 1998 or so, I was home with my kids, and I needed to do something other than be home with my kids.
Oh, I know that feeling quite well after today.
And so I started volunteering for REACH.
Okay,
So I volunteered for several years. I also have a background in social work.
okay,
And in around 2004, I was starting to think about going back to work, and I was talking to somebody at REACH, and they mentioned they had this grant out of the Burlington Police Department. I thought, oh, that sounds perfect
oh,
for me.
excellent.
Perfect combination of hours, the kind of work I wanted to do. So I applied for the job.
And apparently you
And
got
apparently
it.
I got it. So I've been here since 2004.
Great.
So
And hopefully no plans of leaving.
no current plans of leaving.
Which is good for us.
Excellent.
And I think one of the things that's really important about the collaboration, and I've become aware because of how other police departments do it, that the fact that I work for REACH and not for the police department is really important.
Okay.
Because there's certain issues around confidentiality, and I follow REACH's rules, so I'm not bound to the police department's
Oh,
rules.
okay.
So, if I'm talking to somebody about what's going on, and there are things that they may not want the police to know, I don't have to
Okay.
tell
Now,
that.
in that regard, if you know something like, are you bound to say something to the police department if there's like imminent danger or something?
So the situations where I have to say something are standard mandated reporter
Okay.
kinds of things. So if there's a child at risk, an elder at risk, I'm a
Okay.
mandated reporter, and I have to file.
Okay.
have to file with DCF. I do tell people that if I hear something going on, there are certain situations that have come up where I do feel like somebody's in imminent danger.
Okay.
I would talk to them about whether they wanted me to call the police. If they didn't, I wouldn't tell the police.
Okay.
Usually if it's that
Because
dangerous.
it's got to be like a fine
Usually
line.
when it gets to be that dangerous,
Okay.
people want me to say something,
Okay.
but I always check with them. So I don't tell the police something if it's not okay with them for me to tell
Understood.
something. And same thing if their partner's involved in illegal activity, for example, I don't have to report that or,
Okay. Okay. Now, let's back up a little bit. What exactly is meant by domestic violence?
So we define.
Is it like, somebody beating up physical abuse?
So
or-
the way we define domestic violence is it's a pattern of coercive behavior that one person uses to gain and maintain control over another,
Okay.
over their partner. And
Okay, so
usually
it has
when-
to be a pattern. It
It
can't
has
just
to be a pattern.
Okay.
There's a question of power and control. So it's one person trying to have power and control over the other person.
Okay.
So it's not mutual.
Okay.
It's usually a one-way street. There's one person trying to have control over the other.
Okay.
There may be situations where somebody fights back. So, when you're talking about the physical, it may be a mutual fight. But if you're talking about domestic violence, there's a pattern of
Okay.
one person having control over the other.
And that's when REACH becomes involved, generally.
Well, we become involved wherever
Okay.
the pattern is. Wherever
Okay.
wherever it starts.
So it could start as psychological abuse and
Absolutely.
then turn to physical or
Emotional.
Yeah, so we
Emotional.
so we see, you know,
financial abuse too?
yeah, we,
Oh, okay.
you know, basically any way somebody's trying to control another could be considered abusive. So you've
Okay.
got the physical, you've got the emotional, you've got the psychological, you've got the financial. There's something we call identity abuse, which
what's
is
that?
where one person, maybe you have two people that are married from different cultures, and one person doesn't allow the other person to speak their native language or to make their native food or something like that, or maybe they're pushing them, you know, if somebody's gay or lesbian, they may be pushing them to come out to their family before they're ready. There's that kind of thing. And obviously sexual abuse is another big issue.
Okay. Now, is it always between domestic partners?
No. No, it
Okay.
typically can be between domestic partners. It can be a dating relationship. It could
Okay.
be just after just one date.
Okay.
It could be family members.
Now,
brothers,
backing up for a
sisters.
second, if it's just after one date, is there a pattern there, or is it just
Legally,
Okay.
if you're in a dating relationship
Okay.
and there is physical violence,
okay?
then that potentially could be an assault and battery.
Okay.
And often then that's the first sign that, I mean, obviously, usually at that point you start seeing, I mean, if it's happening after one date, it's happening pretty quickly.
Dump this person.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
happening pretty
Whoa.
quickly.
Exactly.
It's happening pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I would say I see sort of two different things. There's what I would call intimate partner violence,
Okay.
which is what REACH is mostly focused on, which is domestic violence between two people that are in some kind of relationship.
Okay.
We also see family violence, and working
Okay,
out of
like-
a police department, you may see, you know, situations with, you know, elder parents and children that are abusive, or kids that are out of control that are dealing with that, or family members that aren't getting along. And sometimes I get involved in those cases. Certainly the police get involved in those cases.
Because you were talking about like sibling as well as
Siblings.
parent abusing child or parent
Right,
abusing
so
Right, or
those
adult
aren't-
child abusing their
like an
senior
elderly
parent.
person or
So
okay.
those aren't cases that REACH and domestic violence agencies usually think about, but
Okay.
when you're working with the police department, clearly the police have to deal with those cases. And so sometimes I get involved in those cases as well.
Okay. Now the programs for REACH though generally focus on that domestic
Intimate partner
partnership.
violence,
Okay.
yes.
Intimate partner. Okay. Wow, you guys are just coming through it. Question. Now you mentioned a little bit about identity abuse. Do you see patterns where it tends to be more in one culture than another culture?
So my view, and from my experience, domestic violence crosses all lines, all cultures,
Okay.
all socioeconomic.
So there's no stereotype.
There's really no stereotype of what, you know, so it can happen in very well-to-do families. Sometimes it's hidden better in that situation. It certainly happens in all cultures. I think there are some cultures that make it harder to report,
Okay.
where there's certain pressures around marriage or staying married or not getting divorced, or certain stigmas around that make it harder to report. But it happens in all cultures. And it
Okay.
certainly happens in the American culture.
And we find with the cultures, people that come from different countries, the police are very different from
Yes.
country to country.
Okay.
And that may
May increase
prohibit-
the fear.
a person from coming forward
Okay.
to us because they're afraid of us
Okay.
as the police.
Yeah, we've seen actually quite a bit of that.
Really? Okay.
You know, where people are afraid of the
Now,
police.
what do you
because
do in that situation? Is there anything to do if they're afraid to seek help?
Well, what we try to do, Saheli, who is a organization for South Asian
Okay.
They've helped a lot.
people, they have come into our station and have done trainings for us to understand the culture
Oh, okay.
and to help us better serve
So you
that population
coming to
when we
meet
go.
them and, okay.
Right, and to give us some indications as to what we should be looking for. And a lot of times, they will work with the outreach worker from Saheli will work with Margaret in contacting that family
Okay.
and trying to
So like reaching out to them
reaching
and
out
approaching
and
them. Okay.
following up. Sometimes they will open up more to Margaret than they would somebody from their own culture, because
They're
don't
afraid
want
of those stereotypes of,
right
the
seeing
stigma
people
attached.
at the church or at functions, and
Oh, okay.
maybe having that get out that they have domestic problems.
So sometimes the outsider is a safer option.
Well,
or-
and sometimes, I mean, I follow up on all the police reports. So if the police go to a house and it's a, another culture where maybe they're afraid of the police, they may not tell the police very much.
Okay.
But I will follow up with a call. And so there's been numerous situations where I've gotten involved with somebody and they have started to open up to me, or we've developed some kind of relationship.
Okay.
And eventually they may or may not want to talk to the police more. Sometimes that's happened, sometimes not.
Okay.
But I still work with them, and I make it very clear I don't work for the police department,
Okay.
which again is why I think it's an advantage not to work for the police department.
Okay.
And one thing I found really interesting, I didn't know when I first started working and doing this job whether it would be a disadvantage, with other cultures. I'm a white American woman, and I have found that in many cases people are more comfortable because I'm not
Really?
part of their,
Okay.
if they tell me what's going on in their family, I'm not part of their community.
Oh, okay.
So, not always, but sometimes that's actually
That
been an
helps.
advantage, which
Okay.
surprised me. I wasn't expecting that to be true.
Okay. Now, because you are that white American female, do you have other members of your staff who are not that role?
We certainly have, we don't have any men on our staff at the
Okay.
moment, although we certainly work with men. So
Okay.
certainly we've had men who have been abuse victims.
Okay.
So it's not just a situation where it's
I was
women.
actually going to ask that question.
Yeah,
How
so we
many-
definitely
yeah.
work with men, and I've had some male clients that I've
Okay.
worked with. We do have people on staff who are women of color.
Okay.
And there have been situations where we've had somebody where their main language is Spanish, and we have a couple of Spanish staff
Okay.
who've ended up working with Anne-Marie because I don't speak Spanish.
Okay. And you do?
I do
No,
not.
but the
They-
staff from REACH
Oh.
The
speak
staff
Spanish, and so they
speaks-
help
Oh,
fill in.
okay.
In Saheli, the staff
Okay.
there
They
will speak
speak-
Hindi or Gujarati
Oh, okay.
to help the communication
Okay.
between.
Now, if somebody does approach REACH because of all of these, not really fears, but like preconceived notions, can they choose who they work with? Or do they just, get assigned a
generally
person?
the general process to work with REACH would be to call REACH and do an intake.
Okay.
So if somebody was calling REACH out of the blue, they would do an intake,
Okay.
and which happens a lot. And they do an intake, and then that intake is assigned to the best advocate for for that person. Since my
Okay.
office is in Burlington, most of the time, if there's a case that comes out of Burlington,
Okay.
it's going to be assigned to me, because I work here, I
Okay.
live up here. I mean, I work here, I'm near where people are located. REACH's main office is in Waltham.
Okay.
So there have been some circumstances that have come up for various reasons where somebody has been assigned to somebody else. Like,
Okay.
for example, if there's the same abuser with more than one victim.
Ooh, hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, so you might not want the same advocate working with both victims.
Oh, okay.
So that's come up before.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that your office is in Burlington and REACH's main headquarters is in Waltham. Statistically, how prevalent is domestic abuse in Burlington compared to the rest of the state or the rest of the country? Is it seems like a generally safe community.
Well, I'm not sure about the rest of the state. I know
Okay.
that we handle almost 200 calls a year,
Okay.
domestic violence related, at least.
Okay.
I would guess.
And that's like
And
the
that-
whole spectrum.
Right, that's the
okay.
whole spectrum.
Okay.
And that's just domestic violence. That's not service of restraining orders,
Okay.
well-being checks that may go on with those restraining
Okay.
orders,
Mhm.
exchanges of children, things of that nature.
Okay. Now, could be like urban myths, but sometimes I've heard stories where the restraining orders do absolutely no good. Is it worth a victim to get a restraining order?
Absolutely, it's a tool. I mean, it's one tool in the toolbox. Typically, we will safety plan with
Okay.
somebody who does get a restraining order, because it is a piece of paper, and the
Okay.
onus is on the defendant of the restraining order not to
Okay.
violate it, because the order itself is civil. Until
Okay.
it's violated, then it becomes criminal.
Oh, okay.
But it's one piece.
It's
You need
definitely-
to safety
okay.
plan. You need to be aware of your surroundings. You need to have know what you're going to do if that order is
Okay.
violated. Because some people, even though they get the order and there's a violation, sometimes they feel bad about calling us to report that violation. You know,
Okay.
they want what's going on to stop, but they realize when they do get that order,
Okay.
in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell people that it is a tool. It means that
Okay.
if you have a restraining order and he shows up at your house and you call the police, he will be arrested.
Okay.
Whereas if you don't have a restraining order and he shows up at your house, you can still call the police, and they will come and they will try and deal with the situation, but unless he's actually done something, they're not going to
Yeah.
arrest him. So it gives a reason for the police to arrest if he shows up. So
Okay.
that's an important tool. But the important thing is to talk to the victim or the person and ask them, whether in some cases, people feel that a restraining order is going to make things worse.
Yes.
And it's going to make things more dangerous. And if it's going to make things more dangerous, then don't get a restraining order.
Okay.
So it's a matter of talking about the safety and finding out whether, is this a guy who generally likes to follow the law, does not want to get arrested,
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't want to get in trouble, or is
Wants
it
to hide everything.
wants to hide
Okay.
everything, keep everything under wraps. For that kind of person, a restraining order is very valuable.
Okay.
For the kind of person that's going to come after you anyway,
Yeah.
then it may create
Okay.
more
So you
reason
still
for him
kind of
to
need
do
to
it. So you
consider it on a case-by-case
yeah, so it's
basis.
not
Correct.
it's not a situation where you can just say in every case you should get a restraining order. And people often face that. People often say, well, you should just get a restraining order. Well, sometimes that's not the right thing to do.
Yeah,
And
okay.
I've certainly encouraged people not to get a restraining order when it felt like it was too dangerous. So it's very important to listen to the person. They know their
Okay.
partner better than anybody else,
Mhm.
and they have a much better idea of whether it's safe or not safe to do that.
Okay. Now, in that victim's opinion, when they're talking to you, do you ever have what they envision the situation to be like versus reality? Sometimes do they kind of,
Do they minimize, or is that what you're
or
asking?
actually do they maximize? Do they say, oh, he's, really psychotic or something, and then it's just their perception where he really isn't that bad?
Generally, I see more of the opposite.
Okay.
Generally, people tend to minimize the abuse and tend to
Okay.
excuse it and think it's not as bad as it.
But that
Partly
probably plays
because they
into the
get used to it.
psychological.
Right, so they get, you get used to a certain
Yeah,
amount,
this is
or
the
it's
way
not
I-
that bad,
yeah,
he's not
okay.
really going to hurt me.
I deserve it anyway. Type.
So you
sometimes,
sort
okay.
of, I see that more, and more often I have to say, he sounds really dangerous.
Okay.
Like, I'm getting scared for you. That happens more often than them maximizing it.
Okay.
I don't think that happens all that much.
Okay. Now, we mentioned that, I know I'm kind of going away from my questions, but you guys
okay.
are.
Okay,
yes.
that's okay, we're fine.
You mentioned that a restraining order is a tool. Are there other tools available? If so, what are they and how effective are they?
Well, you want to certainly safety plan. What I mentioned that earlier.
Okay, what does a safety plan mean? Like
Well,
change your name and
if-
change your,
Well, certainly some people have gone to that
okay.
extent.
The
Right here
witness
in
protection
Burlington.
program?
Right here in Burlington.
Wow,
We,
okay.
We work with one woman that has changed her name and moved, and hopefully when he gets out of jail, he's not going to
Okay.
find her, because this would be the third time.
Okay.
So she has gone to that extent. But safety plan in such a way of, if you're getting those continuous calls, change your phone number.
Okay.
And a lot of people, sometimes they'll like, oh, do I have to do that? Because I've had that number for so long.
Yeah.
And
Well, the
it's-
choice is yours.
Right, and also different. If your abuser gets out of hand, things start to escalate, you can always call 911 from your phone, and either if you hang up and we call back, say, I didn't order that pizza, because by policy we dispatch a unit to check every 911 call.
I've heard
So
about,
that would give us a-
3-year-olds accidentally
Right.
dialing
Oh, yeah.
911.
Oh yeah,
and-
we've all had that experience, but it also gives us an idea that there is something wrong at that address. Sometimes, if it's something that I know about, I may put it on the roll call for a few weeks. If you get a call from this address, a hang-up call, this is potentially what might be going on.
Okay.
So you can take different steps like that. If things escalate, can you leave? Do you have a safe place to go to?
Okay.
Do you have,
Like a support
as we
system.
say, an overnight bag in your car with
Oh, okay.
some copies
keeping
of personal
important
papers
documents.
ready to go? Can you keep them, at work, the personal
Okay.
papers, or do you have somebody that can hold on to them? So a safety plan can be as simple as changing your phone number
Okay.
or changing your whole name and
Okay.
your address and just going underground.
And I think the important thing from what I do with people is really try to talk about the situation.
Okay.
So start bringing up situations of like, okay, so if you're in this situation, what will you do? Because sometimes thinking in advance,
Mhm.
okay, so he comes in, he attacks me, this is what I'm going to do.
Okay.
Thinking about that ahead of time can help in the situation to know what to do. Because sometimes when you're in that situation, you don't
Yeah.
know what to do and you sort of feel
Oh.
paralyzed.
That happens all the time, not just in domestic abuse.
Right.
Well,
So
right.
thinking ahead of time about what to do, and I
Mhm.
think it's sometimes very helpful for people
Okay.
to have somebody who's willing to think about what happens if he, sometimes friends and family don't want to think about the worst. What happens if he comes after me with a knife, or what happens if he's going to do this? What do I do? So we're willing to have that conversation,
Okay.
about what will you do if it gets really bad? What do you do if he starts to,
Okay.
and then, I don't know if you want to mention RAD now.
Yep, we offer the RAD program.
Which stands for,
We do it for,
what's it do?
well,
What does it do?
it's a physical defense type of program.
Oh, okay.
We do RAD kids,
Okay.
which currently we're in our 3rd week of 3 weeks.
Wow. Now, what age group of kids do you work with? Like teenagers or?
We go 8 to 12.
Okay.
We do RAD here at the high school for the senior class girls.
Okay.
So we have the RAD for women, adult women, and that's resist abduction defensively.
Okay.
And then we do RAD for senior citizens because all 3 groups, and we have RAD for men
Okay.
as well, and all 3 groups,
So
4 groups,
Okay.
will defend themselves much differently.
Okay.
A child is going to defend themselves much different from an elder. For example, a child can make a fist, maybe an elder can't
Mhm.
because of arthritis. For example, we teach them to hit with the back of their hand because
Okay.
you can't make that fist. And the women, we go over, different plans, safety
Okay.
plans, and scenarios. So what if this happens? What
Okay.
part of your body can you use? What strong part of your body can you use against
Mm-hmm.
your aggressor's weak part?
Okay.
The same thing with the kids.
Okay.
So we do offer that, and that was part of the original grant. Was that
Oh, okay.
we have quite a few officers up at the station
Okay.
certified in the different dynamics of the RAD programs, and we offer. The chief allows us to run them. We have another grant from the Leahy Clinic
Okay.
supporting each class that we do.
How young can you train?
We do
kids?
the kids 5 to 7. In our experience,
Okay.
we do 8 to 12 for
Okay.
boys and girls.
Okay.
And then for the adult women's class,
Okay.
if you're 16 to 18, you can come with a guardian.
Okay.
And then the seniors classes.
Because I'm just
anybody-
thinking, sometimes you hear stories about, 5-year-olds getting
Mhm.
abducted on their way home from school. So it's like, can you teach a 5
Oh,
or
absolutely.
6-year-old?
Absolutely. The main thing is no adult should be asking a child for anything. And
Okay.
it's okay for them to say no.
Okay.
And the kids program is much different. We cover stranger danger,
Mm-hmm.
car safety, fire safety, as well as the physical resistance. How to, if you're lost in the mall,
Mm-hmm.
who do you go to help for?
Okay.
Say for example, you go into a store to a cashier, and you stick to that cashier
Okay.
until they call 911 for
Yeah.
you.
Till help arrives.
Exactly.
I was actually at Davis Farmland today, and the staff was running around looking for a kid
Mhm.
wearing a red shirt. I'm like, oh yeah, good
Right.
luck with that. But yeah, I'm like, okay, all of us were dressed exactly alike.
Right. Exactly. So we've offered this, and
Yeah.
many of Margaret's
I might talk to you about that
clients
later.
have come in, have
Mhm.
a few years out, when they're ready, they've come
Okay.
in, and they've taken different.
Yeah, we've actually
Different
done a group
parts.
of us. I did
Yes.
it with several clients once,
Oh, wow.
twice actually.
And it's great because it
Yeah.
shows people what they're capable of,
Yeah.
how they can defend themselves.
And also, like Margaret was mentioning, come up with that plan and the scenario. So
Right.
when you are in the moment, you don't really have to think about it. It becomes second nature to
Exactly.
you.
Exactly. You know, somebody thinks because their arms are grabbed that they have nothing else to defend themselves with, and they certainly do.
Yeah, it gives
There's-
people a lot of confidence too.
Okay. Interesting. Kind of like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a good class.
Okay, I digress.
No,
That's why I have
okay.
the notes, because that brings me back into focus. Okay, does abuse tend to be seasonal? Because a lot of times you hear like winter, everybody gets depressed. And is depression related to abuse, or do you ever see any patterns?
No.
Really?
No. I've been doing this full time since 2005,
Okay,
and it's
that surprises me.
It's pretty steady. Sometimes we have our slow weeks, but
Weeks.
Right, we have slow times and busy
Slow
times.
times
It
and
seems
busy.
like
Okay.
everything happens at once, but there's not a clear pattern to when those are.
Okay.
The only pattern I think is sometimes the days of holidays aren't as busy, but sometimes right afterwards we get busy. But I don't know that that is related to, it's
Okay.
not, we can't predict it.
No, it's
We
not
can't
very
predict it.
unpredictable.
That's not very fun. Well, none of this is fun, but it kind of makes your job harder because you can't
Can't
kind of
predict it.
anticipate.
You know, sometimes people that have had incidents years ago, something
Okay.
else happens. You know, something new comes up,
Oh, okay.
and they reach out
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
for help. and
Now, you
assistance.
mentioned like holidays. Is there one holiday that tends to be
There's not really a pattern.
no pattern?
No.
Oh, wow. Now, in your experience, do there tend to be abusers that have some other medical or psychological or some kind of condition that either hasn't been diagnosed or is going untreated? Like, you know, somebody's
So-
depressed and they go off their meds, or they're bipolar and...
So I was thinking about this. So I don't think, we generally say that alcohol or drug abuse or mental illness doesn't cause abuse. I mean, if you
Okay.
go back and look at the fact that it's one person trying to control the other,
Okay,
that's what it's really about, is one person trying to control the other.
okay.
And you can usually see, no matter what, whether there's drug abuse or whether there's mental illness, you usually see that pattern or don't see that pattern.
Okay,
So if that usually, in real cases of domestic violence, that pattern has existed no matter where the person
Okay.
is in their history.
okay,
I do think that sometimes mental illness, drug abuse, those certain kinds of stress
okay.
can make the abuse worse.
Okay.
So it can get more violent
Definitely.
or more dangerous. So I
Mhm.
think it definitely can have an impact that way. And I definitely also think there are cases where there really isn't a pattern of domestic violence,
Okay,
but drug abuse or mental illness may cause a violent incident of some kind.
okay. So the pattern might not
So
necessarily...
you might not really consider it domestic violence. You may
Okay.
really consider it, you know, another problem, and there's been some
Okay.
violence because of that problem. But I wouldn't put that as a pattern of domestic violence. So that's how I've started
Okay.
to really look at it, because I've definitely seen cases where it seems like the abuse was really happening around. But then when you really start talking to the person, it's not really about control
Okay,
in the same way. The
okay.
pattern of power and control.
So you have to kind of
have to look at it
isolate it.
differently.
Okay. I do believe we have a caller.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Greg. What's your question?
Oh, hi, Linda.
Yes.
Another sensational program you have.
Thank you.
And I just want to bring up the fact that the paternal side of my family, there are members that are very violent, just like my paternal grandfather. My mother told me that when my father was growing up, there was one time my paternal grandfather, well, of course he had a drinking problem, but he wasn't Skid Row. He had a good going job. He was a wooden keg maker, and he also experimented with grafting of trees. But the thing is, oftentimes when he would get drunk, he'd also get violent. And there was one time he went and he grabbed his wife and pulled out a big clump of hair, and then my father gave him a punch on the arm, and I guess knowing what happened, he probably got the daylights beaten out of him. I mean, this is the way a lot of the Russian families were. You know, they were. I'm not exactly stereotyping the Russians, but I do know that they do have a bit of a propensity towards fighting. Also, my father was became a street fighter because he was bullied when he first came to this country, like when he was kindergarten age. He didn't speak the language, and the so-called quote-unquote American kids, so to speak, gave him such a rough time that when he became older, he took that frustration out and he started to street fighting them. And let me tell you, he did some serious damage, like break bones, knock teeth out, crack skulls. He was great at breaking ribs. And then he had a sister that did the same thing with girls. I understand that not only did she street fight them, she used to go on the projects and look for fights.
Yep.
So I think, I think both of them should have been in the some sort of a fighting rink. And then I do know one of my father's brothers. He too was a bare fist boxer. Of course, back then, bare fist boxing was legal. So,
Right,
you know, there
exactly.
is a long legacy on the paternal side of the family of fighting. But on my mother's side of the family, who were originally her heritage stems from Czechoslovakia, and they were extremely.
And
So-
what Greg is, what I think he's saying is that it can be a learned behavior,
Okay.
becoming an abuser. You know, a child growing up in a home
Okay.
where there is violence, you know, we see one or two things happening. They're either going to become violent,
Okay.
like the violent person in the home, or they're going to become a victim because
Okay.
that is what they believe to be normal.
Okay.
And if
Although it doesn't happen in every family
Right.
where there's
Oh, well,
violence.
obviously. But
Right.
there
That's-
tends to be that pattern.
that's,
Now,
and
in
I
a
think
s-
that's what Greg was
Okay.
speaking about.
In a situation, though, that what you had mentioned kind of reminded me is if someone is abused, could they turn around to be an abuser on a new victim? Do you ever see
Yes.
that?
Yes, I mean, we often see people that grow up in abusive homes become abusive, or if they've grown up in an abusive home, they end up in an abusive relationship.
So that's where the pattern kind of develops. It's a
Right,
learned
but we see
behavior.
plenty of
Yeah.
cases where they didn't grow up in an abusive home and there's still domestic violence. So
Okay.
it's not an either or. You know, it's
Okay.
not a direct correlation, but there's definitely a correlation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Greg, for calling.
Yes,
You're
good question.
Very insightful. A couple other questions about, growing up or just situations. Do you see a pattern like in some abuse being situational, like moving or having a new child, a birth of a child into the house, or, not only the birth of a child, but then maybe the mother has postpartum depression, or do you ever see patterns like that developing?
So again, I come back to the power and control.
Okay.
Usually in that kind of situation, sometimes I will get involved with somebody when there's been some major stressor in the couple's lives.
That's what I was thinking, a major
There's
stressor.
a major stressor of some kind. A lot of what we've seen recently is economic stress. For example, somebody loses
Okay.
a job. There's some kind of major stressor,
Okay.
and that creates some kind of incident, and the person finally comes in and talks to us somehow.
Okay.
What I have found in talking to people is usually there's a history of power and control. There's a history of
Okay.
one person trying to control, but the stress adds
Redirects it, or
adds and tends to help it escalate.
okay.
So that's what I generally see. So I don't see it as the cause. It's
Okay.
not like all of a sudden you've had a really healthy marriage and then he loses his job and he becomes violent. That's not usually what we
Okay.
see. Usually there's a
See that on TV, and
yeah, usually there's a pattern where there's
Okay.
been very controlling. Maybe he's been very jealous. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
he's, wanted to make sure,
Okay.
of what she wears or whatever.
Isolates from the friends. after they
Isolate. So
get
there's
married.
a pattern, but it
Family.
gets worse with the stressors.
Okay.
And over time, the other thing is, over time, we generally see that abuse escalates. So, I say to people, nobody goes out on a first date, gets beat up, and goes out back for more. That's not how it happens. People meet somebody, they get into a relationship, the guy seems wonderful, or the woman seems wonderful, and things are going along pretty well, you fall in love, and then at some point, the abuse starts happening, and it usually starts slowly. And it usually starts
Well,
with
plus
emotional
a lot
abuse.
of times, and no relationship is perfect. So you might see these things and just consider them, oh, they're not really personality flaws, but they're just issues with the personality.
Right, we can fix them.
And,
Or you
I
might,
can save that
or,
person.
Or
I
you-
can pick my battles, and this one
Exactly.
isn't,
or this isn't that big a deal to me. I'll give this
Exactly.
up, and then after a while, you realize you've given up a lot.
Or then it starts escalating.
And we start, one of the things that we talk about at REACH is, in the beginning, it starts when the abuser is sort of defining the reality. They're kind of defining the rules.
Okay.
And then the victim or survivor, we often use the term survivor,
Okay.
is having to sort of figure out what the rules are and kind of try to follow them and try and keep things smooth. And over time it gets harder and harder. There tends to be a lot more isolation. So, one of the things that happens is the abuser isolates the survivor so that they, get cut off from family and friends. And over time, the violence tends to increase. Now, not every abusive relationship ends up violent, but once violence starts, unless he's really held accountable, the violence usually gets worse.
What if it's just like psychological abuse out of a control? Because what you're describing is exactly like, I had mentioned this friend of mine, ever since they started dating, all of her friends are like, you guys should never be together.
Right.
And then they got married and, things kind of got more intense, but she's like, no, I can handle it. And then a child entered the mix and
Do you want to stay for the child? And
yeah.
Right. So I have heard
But
over...
he got even more controlling after the child.
Right.
Okay.
I have heard, and people ask about psychological abuse a lot, and I was very surprised the first time I heard this, but I've heard it so many times since I now very firmly believe it. The psychological abuse can be as bad or worse than the physical violence. Because it tends to
it's
affect your
hidden, too.
self-esteem. So it tends to affect how you think about yourself. So you start to think less of yourself, and it gets harder and harder to make it get out. Whereas most people, if they get hit, they know that's wrong. So they can see that, that he was wrong for doing that. But the psychological stuff can be really hard to combat in a way. And so we provide a lot of support around those issues. And we do run support groups. That is one of the services that REACH offers.
Okay.
We do have support groups. And I have found in support groups, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with psychological abuse or serious physical abuse. So I've had women in all ranges of that kind of abuse happen in one group, and it's fine because basically the issues are very similar.
Right.
It's just what the abuse looks like.
Okay. How does bullying, or does bullying fit in with your program?
not our program directly.
Okay.
Other than we do address.
Because there generally is the pattern.
Right. And the schools have, by state law, they have a protocol.
Okay.
And our youth detective,
Okay.
Detective Tom Fournier, he has a memorandum of understanding with each school.
Okay.
And again, with bullying, domestic violence, it's a team approach.
Okay.
So the bullying, not so much we deal with.
Okay.
Sometimes we do see that it's an indication of what is,
There might be issues.
when you
that-
dig deeper with the
Okay.
child that is
Okay.
bullying, sometimes that may be an indication that something
Okay.
more is going on. But typically, that's not something that we deal with
Okay.
directly.
Right.
What about, because I'm just thinking back, the past few years, bullying seems to have really come, headline. And a lot of the bullying issues also tend to be online, like through
Right.
Facebook or through,
The in-
message boards or
internet
whatever. And, do you see any of that playing a role in your work?
I do, with
I do
the
too.
cyber investigations, as far as receiving text messages from some websites that
Okay.
you can disguise your information from, the use of the throwaway phones,
Okay.
emails, hacking into emails and Facebook, and it's endless, and it's very difficult to work those cases, but they can be worked because
Okay.
we work closely with the DA's office, the cyber crime
Okay.
unit, and they're great as far as helping us tracking down different IP addresses, different phone numbers.
Okay.
I mean, it's
Yeah, you hear
it's
all-
amazing. what the technology, because when
Technology
I
can
was
be
a kid-
overwhelming.
when I was a kid, you go home, either they called your house, and
Mm-hmm.
you didn't hear it until the next day.
Right.
Now today, everything is like instantaneous.
Yeah. Everybody knows
As
before you
as
even
we
get
can
home.
see, you can see, and hear it constantly.
Yeah.
And I think with the bullying, like the domestic violence, the more educated the public has on the topic and knowing the signs of
Okay.
what bullying is, what domestic violence is, and they understand that, there are people like Margaret out there
Okay.
in Reach and Sahelli, and you can come to the police department.
Okay.
I mean, our general thought process isn't just to go out and arrest everybody.
Oh, it's not?
It isn't. It isn't. We
It's
want
that
to make sure
sarcasm there.
above all,
Yeah.
everybody is safe.
Mhm.
The scene is safe, the situation is safe, and people understand what their options are,
Okay.
what their avenues are to take for help. To-
Okay.
What I would say, add to that, is that a lot of the technology there is today is used as part of the way to control people.
Okay.
So, we now with cell phones, people need to let their partners know where they are every minute, every day. So there's a lot of control around, you didn't call me back. Why aren't you texting me? Why aren't you whatever? So there's a lot around the phone.
Okay.
Certainly on Facebook,
I'm
certainly.
also thinking like emails going in and reading.
Certainly,
Right,
we have
hacking
the
into
issue
the
of
emails,
hacking into
yes.
the email or looking into the email. Certainly, there's issues of tracking, so tracking somebody with their phone. Or the
GPS.
Oh, yeah,
GPS on the
GPS.
phone. And so there's more issues to talk about in terms of safety, because you
Okay.
have to talk about sort of the safety around internet, safety around your phone, safety around your car. So we do see technology being used as another way
Which just
to control somebody.
controls, the amount of control just jumps exponentially with all of
Because
these
you want to
extra
have
tools.
and I was thinking about the bullying, and I agree with what Anne-Marie said. It's not really but sometimes in domestic violence, what you see is one person's kind of bullying another.
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
some of the behavior is similar.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, see, that's kind of why I was
Yeah,
wondering
so there's
where the line
similar
is drawn.
behavior at times of, one person bullying the other person, but it's a little different than I think what we're talking about bullying in
Okay.
schools.
And, along those lines, you work on a one abuser, one victim, or one abuser, one survivor. You don't really deal with like 6 people ganging up on this one person,
Yeah, that would be a different issue.
or like the 2 parents ganging up on a child, or
Yeah, that would I would
Okay.
That would
consider
be
that a different
right,
issue.
That would be
That would be a
more of a
different issue.
police issue that we
Okay.
would, if it's a parent-child thing, something that we may handle in
Okay.
conjunction with DCF or the
we
child abuse unit.
we have had cases where, you've got one person and a new partner sort of being abusive to the old partner, or situations like that. So there's been a
Okay.
couple of cases where new girlfriends or boyfriends have gotten involved
Oh, okay.
and been involved, but I still look at that as sort of the issues between the two people that were originally involved, and they might pull in other people, but
Okay. Now, I think you already mentioned this, but when does REACH become involved? Basically, if there's either some kind of police involvement,
So there's
or
a-
if somebody approaches you, or
so there's several ways that REACH would be involved. One is that REACH is a general domestic violence agency. Sometimes
Okay.
people find out about REACH and call REACH directly and do an intake, and eventually, if they're from Burlington area, or actually any place sort of
Okay.
north, so Woburn, Burlington, any place north
Okay.
of in this area, I generally get that case.
okay,
I follow up on all the police reports, so if there's a domestic violence that comes through the police department, I read those reports and I cold call the victims
okay,
in those cases and offer services. Sometimes they want them, sometimes they don't.
Okay.
I call them in either case, and if they don't want services, that's fine. I give them my number and they can call when
okay.
at some later point, which people often do.
Okay.
We also have
The
working.
cold call has to be tough,
Well, you get used to it, and
because you
just
never know what kind of
Well, it's
situation you're
not-
calling into.
Well, a lot of times now, officers that respond
We'll let them know
in the
that I may
uniform
call.
will say that somebody will
Oh,
be
okay.
calling.
And sometimes people don't want to talk to me, and that's fine. They don't have to. Sometimes they'll call me back at a later time. Sometimes they talk to me the second or third time I call. After there's been a couple of incidents. I mean, I don't keep hounding people, but if there's
We know
more
where
than
you
one
live.
incident, I'll call them the second
Right.
incident. And we also have a working relationship with Leahy. So the Leahy Social Work Department will call me in when they
Right.
have a domestic
Okay.
violence case. So, and sometimes people hear about what we're doing other places, and so I will just get a call directly. I heard about you, or somebody, my
Okay.
therapist suggested I call you, or, and there's been some cases where DCF has suggested to people they get involved working with a domestic violence agency, and we get referred that way. So referrals come in different ways,
Okay.
but I also do follow up on the police reports.
Okay. What advice do you have for someone who doesn't feel safe at home, who might not be ready to make that phone call?
They're not ready to, well, if I think my advice is to reach out,
Okay.
to tell somebody. Either there is a hotline, so Reach has a hotline
Okay.
which people can call. They can call anonymously, so they can just ask the question. They don't have to say who they are. They don't have to say where they live. They
Okay.
can just call the hotline. I think you're displaying that hotline number. I don't know, but I
they
can
have it.
certainly give that
I have it.
hotline.
Yeah, why not? If
So
you
the
happen to know
hotline
what it
is 1-800-899-4000,
Okay.
and they can just call, and
And it's 24 hours?
it's 24 hours. Not, somebody may not always answer. Sometimes they call you back, but
Okay.
usually they answer it. Carry around a phone. So,
Okay.
so there is the Reach hotline. People can call anonymously.
Okay.
If you're really not ready to make that phone call, if there's somebody that you can tell,
Okay.
you
Could they
know,
also like look
our
at your
website.
website, or is there
They could look
information
at
on
our
the website
website,
to kind of
to kind of
gain
get that information.
confidence?
I think the important thing is
Okay.
to know that there's help out there.
Okay.
You don't have to go through this alone. Well, we do Reach does keep information confidential. Like I said, we're
Okay.
mandated reporters, but other than that, we keep things confidential. And the other thing about mandated reporting is I will always tell somebody if I'm going to file a report.
Okay.
So I don't file a report with DCF anonymously.
Okay.
I will always tell you that I'm going to do that. And when it's come up, which it has, I've always told people that I'm doing it.
Right. And one thing that I would add is you can check out the police department's website as well.
Okay.
But if you do make that phone call to Reach, or you do check out these websites, maybe do it from a computer that's outside
Okay.
the place where you're not safe. Whether you go to the
Oh,
Right,
library,
yeah.
that's a good point.
do it from work,
Okay.
because oftentimes there'll be counter surveillance by an abuser, and
Okay.
they will check the cookies of the
And they'll see that.
internet. They will
you've
check the
been-
phone
okay.
to see what numbers have been called when they're not around. Some people have even gone so far, some abusers, of wiretapping their own phones
Wow.
to find out what is being said on the phone
Okay.
when they're out of the house.
Right.
So I would do it from a safe location.
But I would say the best thing is to reach out, and there's support out there, and to find a
Okay.
way to get support.
There's so
even
many
if it's
different
anonymously.
options out there available.
Are there warning signs or flags, yellow flags that go up to warn somebody this is a potentially
So
Violent relation.
I always come back to two things. One is sort of the things that I look at are, first, always listen to your gut feeling, but looking at the issues of power and control
okay?
and boundaries. So, if you're starting to date somebody and he's starting to criticize everything you wear and want to tell you exactly what to wear, it's a kind of a red flag. Like, what's that about? Now, sometimes there may be a situation where, a particular function's much dressier than the way you've dressed
Yeah.
up, and a pointer might be a good
Situational,
Right.
not
Right. So
Not a
it's not
classic
it's
type
not
of
a,
thing.
it's
Yeah.
not always that way. But if he's starting to tell you what to wear all the time, that's kind of a red flag. So looking at the issues of control.
Okay.
And then the other thing is, abusive relationships are inherently not good about respecting your boundaries.
okay.
So, somebody who's sort of very invasive of things that you might want to do, or, things that are making you kind of uncomfortable,
Okay.
like, pay attention to that.
And like you also mentioned earlier, like isolating you. You
Right.
can't go see your
Isolating you
friends. You
from
have
your
to stay
family
with
and
them.
Huge
friends.
red flag. Huge red flag. If the person has a history of abusive relationships with other people, that's a big red flag. We see that a lot, actually. People generally are abusers don't just abuse one person. They're generally abusive in all of their romantic relationships. Sometimes there are other ones too, but so I would look at those things and
Okay.
just pay attention.
Controlling the money.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you hear on a visa, threatening to turn you into ICE or
Okay.
terminate your visa, things like that. People will often
Okay.
say,
And I think the thing to know is that there is help. and you don't have to go through it alone.
Okay. Not sure if this is just asking it in a different way, but one of the other questions that I had was, how can someone protect him or herself from an abusive relationship? Like if they see that pattern, how can they?
Again, maybe ask for help,
Okay.
call a hotline, call a police department. A lot of police departments now have officers dedicated to domestic violence. And the DA's office, Middlesex County DA's
Okay.
office, they have an abundance of information, you know, in their office, on their website. Just about any sort of government agency now will have, DCF will have, you know, some good information. That's Department of Children and Families. It used to be the DSS.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, how they get
And I would
involved.
add to that, listen to your gut.
Mm-hmm.
So, if things
Okay.
don't feel right, it probably isn't right.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Stay out of situations that like stay out of the kitchen where there are knives, for example. So if things starting to get violent, think about escape routes. If the
Okay.
relationship is violent, think about escape routes. How will you get out? Think about safety planning.
Notify a few close friends
Let-
saying.
Right,
One of the best
exactly.
things to do is to make sure that people know what's going on. I mean, one
Okay.
of the things is don't keep the secret.
Okay.
Sometimes
Sometimes that's hard to do,
it's
though.
sometimes really hard to
Right.
do. That's where, telling somebody, but I mean, I think just paying attention to the situation,
Okay.
and, I think that's the best thing you can do.
Okay. Now, what advice could you give someone who's not in the abusive relationship but knows about it? Like, for instance,
that
my
is-
sister
that
is.
is,
So,
yes.
What advice can you give that
so-
person?
Okay.
So
get
you
them.
wanna- You need to really work with the person
Okay.
that is in the situation, where they're at in the situation.
Okay.
They may not be ready to get up and leave.
Okay.
They may not be ready to hear everything that you
Okay.
have to say as a supportive person.
Okay.
But just let them know that you're always there for them,
Okay.
that they can always call you. You're not going to judge them. You're not
Okay.
going to hold anything against them. Just leave that door open,
I
that they
think
can always
Okay.
call you.
I think one of the things that I tell people, and I end up sometimes talking to family members
Okay.
in this situation, is to remember that the abuser is going to work very hard to isolate the person from friends
Okay.
and families. So this isn't a situation where you need to use tough love. This is a situation where you want to let somebody know that you're there. So don't give them an ultimatum. If you don't leave him, I'm not going to talk to you again. I've
Okay.
known
Right.
people that have done that.
Wow.
That doesn't help the situation. So letting them know, don't let them isolate the person completely from you. So let them know you're there. If the person can't see you because they're not allowed to,
Yeah.
which can
It's-
happen,
okay.
let them know when you're ready, I'm here for you.
Okay.
Right.
So don't take it personally. Know that the person may not see you because it may not be safe for them to see you.
Okay.
And to let them know that you'll be there no matter what when they're
Okay.
ready. When they need to make that phone call, when they need to come and, have a place to stay, when they need to talk, you're there and available. That's
'Cause
the
I'm-
best thing you can do.
Because I'm thinking about this friend of mine, where she confided in me saying that, this is his pattern, and when I brought my child to the pediatrician, 3 separate people from the pediatrician's office asked me if I was safe at home.
Right.
Hit me like a ton of bricks because I didn't realize there was anything wrong. What should I do? And, even now I keep saying we need to get together when you're available. When you're available, she's like, oh, well, this is busy and this kid's sick and then we have to go on vacation. I mean,
Right.
I feel helpless
It's-
going, I'm here, hello. But
And that's sometimes it's hard and I mean, I face this sometimes doing the work. Sometimes you are helpless. Sometimes a person really has to make the decision themselves if they're ready to do something. But the best thing you can do is let them know that you care, that you're available, and that you won't judge them. A lot of people who are facing abuse deal with a lot of judgment. There's a lot of judgment out there. Why haven't you left? Why do you stay? Why?
You need to do
All
this,
these
you need to
questions,
do
you
that.
need to do this. There's a lot of giving of advice, and people aren't always ready for that. So a lot of it, and that's why the approach at Reach is very much work with people where they are. I work with people whether they're in the relationship or out of the relationship. I try very hard not to give advice and not to tell people what to do, to help them figure out what to do themselves. So I think that's a really important approach. And I think the other thing is, state it as it is. I mean, don't pretend nothing's wrong if something's wrong.
Okay.
Like, I think it's okay to say, I'm worried for you.
Yeah.
You know, I'm scared he's going to hurt you.
Hmm.
You know, pointing it out because people do tend to minimize. So pointing it out but it has to be without judgment. And sometimes that's a hard balance.
that's
More so with the psychological and emotional, because that's not out there like the physical. And you acknowledge that you know what she's going through and what, you know, in some cases what he's going through.
Okay.
And that you're there to help. You get it. You get what's going on.
You probably won't believe this, but we are just about out of time.
Oh my goodness.
Surprise! Now, I do want to ask you to plug your upcoming event real
Okay,
quickly.
so Reach
30
is hav-
seconds or less.
Okay, Reach is having a big fundraiser October 19th. It's going to be held at the Moakley Courthouse in Boston.
There's my timer.
And you can find out more about it on the website.
On the website. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you found our conversation as informing and enlightening as I have. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Have a great evening and a safe week. Thanks. Good night.
Wild.
What was that?
It was like static. Did you guys hear that in here?
No.
Oh, okay.
So could
It's
you
like
not
a
hear
laugh.
me?
No, we could hear you. It was just a big static, but it's not a
Oh.
big deal. Because it only happened in like the last minute. But great show, guys. That was
Okay.
very
Do you guys
informative.
know how many people watch your show or how what kind of...
I think I have a decent following as far as the demographics. I'm not sure because a friend of mine who is roughly my age, her husband is like the biggest fan of this show.
Oh.
And then I was leaving the rec department with my 2-year-old son, and this elderly woman who's probably like mid-70s called me over to her car and said, I see you on TV and I love watching your show. So I have no
So
idea.
I'm wondering whether I'll get any calls from people saying, oh, I saw you on TV.
I honestly, I don't know. So I did take,
My kids didn't see us because we don't live here.
Well, my kids didn't either, but I'd love to be able
I
to.
will.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I just need to test this mic, right?
Yeah, I will get DVD copies, but I don't think.
Just, I'm gonna test the mic, and then I'm gonna test the cable by plugging it into another mic. So you wanna just go try it out?
In the berry.
So.
Close enough, but far enough.
Thank God I don't live in Burlington. I would hate to live in Burlington
No.
to do this job.
My poor kids would take a beating every day because of their mother.
It sounds fun, that it.
It does?
I have know something, I mean, when my kids are growing up, it'd be awful to go, oh my, I want to go to that house, or I don't want to, yeah, just me.
Alright, whatever.
Yeah,
It could be the channel. I don't know.
their parents, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that.
Or it could be getting, I don't know.